Somewhere in the grey water of the North Atlantic, there is a fish. It is not beautiful. It has a blunt head, a soft pale belly, and a single small whisker beneath its chin that it uses to taste the mud at the bottom of the sea. It does not leap like a marlin. It does not shimmer like a tuna. For most of human history, nobody wrote poems about it, and nobody painted it on the walls of palaces. And yet this plain, patient, unremarkable fish did something that no king and no general ever managed to do. It moved the center of the world. It pulled fragile wooden ships across an ocean that everyone believed would swallow them whole. It fed armies, built cities, financed empires, and helped create the sprawling nation that would one day call itself the New World. Its name is cod, and this is the story of how a fish changed everything. To understand why cod mattered so much, you first have to understand what kind of animal it is, because almost everything about the modern world that grew up around it comes down to a few strange facts of biology. Cod are enormous eaters and enormous breeders. A single large female can carry millions of eggs inside her at once. In the age before industrial fishing, the great fish gathered on the shallow banks of the North Atlantic in numbers that are almost impossible to picture today. Sailors described water that seemed to boil with them. They spoke of schools so thick that a ship could barely push through, of fish stacked so densely that you could scoop them out of the sea in a basket. For hungry people living on the edge of a cold continent, this was not just food. It was a miracle that repeated itself every single year. But abundance alone would not have been enough. Herring were abundant too, and so were many other creatures of the sea. What made cod special was what happened to it after it was caught. Cod is a lean fish. Its white flesh holds almost no fat, and that single quality changed the course of history. Fatty fish spoil quickly. The oil in them turns rancid, and no amount of salt can fully save them. But a fish with almost no fat can be preserved for years. Split it open, pack it in salt, dry it in the wind and the sun, and you are left with something that looks like a stiff plank of pale wood. It weighs almost nothing. It does not rot. It can be stacked in the hold of a ship and carried across the world. And when a hungry family finally soaks it in fresh water, it comes back to life as tender, flaky, nourishing protein. In a world with no refrigerators, no freezers, and no cans, dried salted cod was one of the first foods that human beings could truly store and truly travel with. It was, in a very real sense, the original portable meal. The first people to understand this were not the explorers we usually celebrate. Long before Columbus, long before anyone in southern Europe was dreaming of a route to the Indies, there were the Vikings. The Norse of Scandinavia lived in a cold, dry, windy land, and they discovered that they did not even need salt to preserve cod. All they had to do was hang the fish on wooden racks in the frigid winter air and let it freeze and dry at the same time. The result was stockfish, hard as leather and nearly indestructible, and it could last for as long as 10 years. This was the fuel of the Viking Age, when Norse warriors and settlers pushed out across the ocean in their long open boats. They carried dried cod with them, a food that would not spoil no matter how far they sailed or how long the voyage took. Around the year 1000, a man named Leif Erikson reached the coast of North America, roughly 500 years before Columbus was even born. The Vikings did not stay, but it is no accident that they reached a new continent carrying the very fish that lived along its shores. Then came the Basques, and here the story takes its first strange turn. The Basque people, who live in the mountainous corner of land between what is now Spain and France, were among the greatest sailors and fishermen of the medieval world. They had something the Norse did not. They had salt, produced in warm coastal regions to the south, and they had generations of skill at whaling in the deep ocean. By the Middle Ages, the Basques were selling enormous quantities of salted cod all across Europe, and everyone wanted to know where they were getting it. Because here is the mystery. The cod near Europe were not enough to explain the flood of fish the Basques were selling. They seemed to have access to a secret fishing ground, an inexhaustible supply that no one else could find. Some historians believe the Basques may have been crossing the entire Atlantic to fish the waters off North America decades, perhaps even a full century, before any official discovery. And if they were, they told no one. There was too much money at stake. When you have found the richest fishing ground on earth, you do not put it on a map. You keep your mouth shut and you get rich. Which brings us to the year 1497, and to a man sailing under the flag of England. His name was John Cabot, an Italian navigator hired by merchants in the port city of Bristol. Cabot was looking for a westward route to Asia, the same dream that had launched Columbus a few years earlier. He did not find Asia. What he found instead was a rocky, fog-bound coast that he claimed for the English crown, a place he called the Newfoundland. And there, in the waters off that coast, he found something that stunned his entire crew. The sea was so thick with cod that they could barely row through it. His men reported that they caught fish simply by lowering weighted baskets over the side and hauling them back up full. They did not need nets, they did not need hooks, they only needed to reach into the water. When Cabot returned to England, the news that mattered most to the merchants was not about a route to the Indies, it was about the fish. He had found the greatest treasury of cod that the world had ever seen, and the race to reach it began almost immediately. That treasury had a name: the Grand Banks. Off the coast of Newfoundland, the seafloor rises up into a series of vast underwater plateaus, shallow shelves, where the water is only tens of fathoms deep. Here, a cold current sweeping down from the Arctic collides with a warm current pushing up from the south. Where they meet, the water churns with nutrients, and those nutrients feed a bloom of tiny plankton, and that plankton feeds small fish, and those small fish feed the cod. It was, for hundreds of years, the most productive fishing ground on the face of the planet. Ships came from England, from France, from Portugal, from Spain, all of them crossing thousands of miles of dangerous open ocean for the chance to fill their holds with fish. The voyage was brutal and often deadly. But the reward was so great that they kept coming, year after year, generation after generation, until the Grand Banks were woven into the economy of half of Europe. To understand why the demand was so ferocious, you have to understand the role of religion in medieval life. The Catholic Church, which governed the spiritual world of most of Europe, forbade the eating of meat on a great many days of the year. There were fast days, there were feast days that required abstinence beforehand, and there was the long season of Lent. On all of these days, warm-blooded animals were off the table, but fish was allowed. By some estimates, more than half the days of the calendar year were days on which a faithful Catholic could not eat meat, but could eat fish. Now, imagine the demand that this created. Millions upon millions of people, spread across an entire continent, all needing an affordable source of protein for well over half the year. Fresh fish spoiled within days and could only feed those near the coast. But salted, dried cod could be shipped anywhere, stored for years, and sold cheaply to the poor and the wealthy alike. Cod was not just a food, it was the answer to a religious calendar that governed the eating habits of an entire civilization, and whoever controlled the supply controlled a fortune. And as the fish spread across the continent, it wove itself into the daily life and cooking of nation after nation, so deeply that many of those dishes are still treasured today. In Portugal, salted cod became so beloved that it earned an affectionate nickname as the faithful friend, and the country built up a tradition that boasts of a different cod recipe for every single day of the year. In Spain, it became the heart of countless regional dishes, soaked and simmered and folded into rich stews. In the south of France, cooks pounded it into a smooth, creamy spread flavored with garlic and olive oil. Across Italy, the Caribbean, West Africa, and Scandinavia, each culture found its own way to bring the stiff, dried planks of fish back to life. A food that had begun as nothing more than a clever way to keep protein from spoiling became, over the centuries, a cornerstone of the way whole peoples ate and celebrated. The humble cod had done something remarkable. It had not only fed people, it had shaped their tables, their traditions, and their sense of who they were. Turning a living fish into that imperishable plank of protein was itself a demanding craft, and it shaped the rhythm of life in every fishing settlement. When the boats came in heavy with the day's catch, the real work had only just begun. The cod had to be split open by hand with astonishing speed, the backbone cut away, the flesh washed and layered with a precise measure of salt. Then came the drying. The fish spread out on wooden platforms called flakes or laid across the bare rocks of the shore, turned again and again, so that the wind and the weak northern sun could pull out the moisture without letting the flesh spoil. Too much salt ruined it, too little, and it rotted before it was ready. A hard rain at the wrong moment could destroy an entire season of labor. Whole families took part in this work. The men out at sea on the boats, the women and the children on the shore, tending the drying racks from dawn to dusk. A finished, properly cured cod was the product of skill handed down through generations, and once it was dry and stacked, it was as good as money in the ports of Europe. For a long time, the fishing was done from ships that sailed back to Europe, but slowly, a different pattern emerged along the North American coast. Fishermen began to stay. They built drying racks and small settlements on the shores of Newfoundland and, further south, in a place that would come to be called New England. And it was here, in this rocky corner of North America, that cod stopped being merely a food and became the foundation of a whole society. The early settlers of New England did not have gold. They did not have fertile plantation soil or a warm climate. What they had was the sea, and the sea was full of cod. Fishing became the engine of the entire colonial economy. Boys grew up in fishing boats. Towns grew up around harbors. Fortunes were built one dried fish at a time. In the colony of Massachusetts, cod became so central to life and to wealth that a carved wooden model of the fish was hung in the chamber where the government met. They called it the sacred cod, and it hangs there to this day. A reminder that the entire Commonwealth was built on the back of a humble bottom feeder. But the story of cod in the New World is not only a story of prosperity, and this is the part that is often left out. It is also bound up with one of the darkest chapters in human history. As New England grew rich on fish, its merchants found new markets far to the south, in the sugar islands of the Caribbean. Those islands were dominated by enormous plantations, and those plantations were worked by enslaved Africans in conditions of unimaginable cruelty. The plantation owners did not want to waste valuable land growing food. They wanted to grow sugar, because sugar was money. So they needed cheap food shipped in from somewhere else, and cod was the perfect answer. The lowest grade of salted cod, the damaged and broken pieces that could not be sold to European buyers, was packed off to the Caribbean to feed the enslaved. It even had a name. It was called the West India Cure, and it was among the cheapest food that money could buy. This trade became one leg of a vast and terrible commercial web that stretched across the Atlantic. New England ships carried salted cod to the sugar islands. In the islands, that cod helped feed the enslaved people who produced sugar and molasses. The ships then carried molasses and sugar back to New England, where the molasses was distilled into rum. And rum, in turn, was one of the goods traded on the coast of Africa in exchange for human beings, who were then carried across the ocean in chains to those same plantations. Cod was not a bystander in this system. It was a working part of it. The wealth of many of the great merchant families of colonial New England, the families sometimes called the codfish aristocracy, was drawn from a trade that connected a fish on the Grand Banks to the machinery of slavery in the Caribbean. It is an uncomfortable truth, but it is a true one. The fish that built the New World also helped sustain some of its greatest crimes. By the 1700s, cod had become so essential to the American colonies that it began to shape the birth of a nation. When the American colonies broke away from Britain and fought their War of Independence, the fishing grounds off Newfoundland became a matter of fierce dispute. As the war ended and diplomats gathered to negotiate the peace, one American delegate refused to sign any treaty that did not guarantee his young country the right to fish those waters. His name was John Adams, and he considered the cod fisheries so vital to the survival of the United States that he was willing to risk the entire peace agreement over them. In the final treaty, signed in 1783, the Americans secured their access to the Great Banks. To Adams and many others, This was not a minor detail. The right to catch cod was seen as a matter of national survival, as important in its own way as any question of territory or trade. A fish had earned its place in the founding documents of a country. For centuries, the abundance of cod seemed to have no limit. People genuinely believed that the sea could never be emptied, that the fish were simply too many to run out. And for a long time, the way that people fished kept that belief alive, because the technology was so limited that it barely made a dent. In the great age of the fishing schooners, in the 1800s, men sailed out from ports like Gloucester in Massachusetts on graceful wooden ships. When they reached the banks, they did not fish from the schooner itself. Instead, they rowed out in tiny, flat-bottomed boats called dories, just 1 or 2 men to a boat, and they set their lines by hand across the freezing water. It was some of the most dangerous work in the world. Fog could swallow a dory in an instant and separate it from its ship. Storms rose without warning. Countless fishermen rowed out and never came back, lost to the cold and the sea. The town of Gloucester alone lost thousands of its men over the generations, and the grief of those losses ran through every fishing community on the coast. But for all its danger, this kind of fishing had a natural limit. One man in a small boat with a hand line can only catch so many fish. The cod, for all the death and struggle it caused, was in no danger from the dory. The danger came later, and it came from the machines. In the late 1800s and into the 1900s, steam power arrived on the fishing grounds. Ships no longer depended on the wind. They could drag enormous nets called trawls across the seafloor, sweeping up everything in their path. This was already a vast leap in killing power, but it was only the beginning. After the Great Wars of the 20th century, a new kind of vessel appeared on the Grand Banks, and it changed everything. These were the factory freezer trawlers, floating processing plants the size of city blocks. They did not need to hurry home before their catch spoiled, because they froze the fish on board the moment it was hauled up. They could stay at sea for weeks or months. They used sonar, developed during wartime, to hunt submarines, to find the schools of cod with terrifying precision. There was nowhere for the fish to hide anymore. A single one of these ships could catch in an hour what an entire fleet of old schooners might have caught in a season. The sea that people had believed was infinite was suddenly facing an appetite that truly was infinite. As the fishing grew more powerful, nations began to fight over who had the right to the fish. Nowhere was this more dramatic than in the far north, in a series of confrontations that became known as the Cod Wars. The small island nation of Iceland depended on cod almost totally for its survival. Fishing was not one industry among many for Iceland. It was very nearly the whole economy. And as foreign fleets, especially from Britain, swept the waters around the island, Iceland watched its lifeblood being pumped away by outsiders. So Iceland did something bold. It declared that the waters around its coast, first out to 12 nautical miles, then 50, then finally 200 nautical miles, belonged to it alone. Britain refused to recognize these claims and sent its fishing fleet in anyway, protected by warships. What followed, across 3 separate confrontations in the 1950s, the 1970s, and again in the mid-1970s, was a strange and tense standoff on the open ocean. Icelandic patrol boats used special cutters to slice through the nets of British trawlers, destroying their catch. British warships rammed Icelandic vessels. Iceland even threatened to shut down a vital military base and walk away from its Western alliances entirely. And in the end, tiny Iceland won. The world accepted its right to control the waters around its shores, and the principle that a nation could claim the sea for 200 nautical miles out from its coast spread across the globe. A war had been fought, and nearly turned deadly, over a fish. But all the treaties and all the fishing limits in the world could not solve the deeper problem, which was simply that human beings were catching cod faster than cod could reproduce. And here we arrive at the tragedy at the heart of this story. Off the coast of Newfoundland, on the very Grand Banks where John Cabot had marveled at fish so thick you could scoop them in a basket, the great population of northern cod began to collapse. Year after year, the catches grew smaller. The fish that were caught grew younger and smaller too, because the older breeding fish were being wiped out before they could reproduce. Scientists warned that the stock was in danger, but too many jobs and too much money depended on the fishing, and the warnings were softened, delayed, and ignored. Everyone assumed that the cod would bounce back the way it always had. They were wrong. On the 2nd of July, in the year 1992, the government of Canada did something that would have been unthinkable to any fisherman of the previous 500 years. It shut the fishery down. It declared a moratorium on catching northern cod, banning almost all fishing for the species on the Grand Banks. The population had fallen so low to a tiny fraction of what it had once been that there was no other choice. And with that single decision, an entire way of life ended overnight. Something on the order of 30,000 to 40,000 people lost their livelihoods in a matter of days. It was the largest single layoff in the history of Canada. Entire towns in Newfoundland, communities that had lived off the cod for centuries, that had been founded on the cod and had never known any other way of being, suddenly had no work and no future. Young people packed up and left. Harbors fell silent. The boats sat empty at the docks. A civilization built on a fish had watched that fish very nearly disappear. And here is the most sobering part. For decades, the cod did not come back. People had assumed the moratorium would last a few years, that the sea would heal and the fish would return as they always had. But the collapse was so severe that the ecosystem itself seemed to have shifted. Other creatures moved into the space the cod had left behind. The old balance of the Grand Banks, which had held for as long as anyone could remember, was broken. Only slowly, over many long years, have there been faint signs of recovery, and even now, the great cod of the Northwest Atlantic are a shadow of the endless multitudes that once boiled in the water off Newfoundland. The fish that had seemed infinite, the fish that generations swore could never be emptied from the sea, had been very nearly emptied within a single human lifetime. So, what are we to make of the history of this plain and humble fish? In one sense, the cod is a story of triumph. This unglamorous bottom feeder fed Europe through its long religious calendar. It fueled the voyages that reached a new continent. It built the economy of New England, funded the birth of a nation, and drew the map of the modern ocean. Without cod, the settling of North America would have looked entirely different, and the world we live in now would not be the world we know. Few creatures have ever shaped human history so profoundly while asking so little in return. It only ever wanted to swim in the cold water and taste the mud with its little whisker, and in doing so it carried the weight of empires on its pale back. But in another sense, the cod is a warning, and it may be the most important warning of all. For 500 years, human beings looked at the North Atlantic and saw a supply of food that could never run out. They were certain of it. The abundance was so vast, so overwhelming, that the idea of the sea ever being empty seemed like a childish fear, and they were wrong. They were catastrophically wrong. The lesson of the cod is that no abundance is truly infinite, that even the richest treasury on earth can be spent down to nothing if we take from it faster than it can replenish itself, and that we are often most blind to a limit precisely when we are certain that no limit exists. The cod built the new world, and then it very nearly vanished, teaching us a lesson about the price of forgetting that the natural world has an edge. Somewhere in the grey water of the North Atlantic, there is still a fish. It has a blunt head and a soft belly, and a small whisker beneath its chin. It is trying, slowly, to come back. Whether it ever fully returns is, in the end, up to us. Because the same species that nearly wiped it out is the only one that can choose to let it recover. The story of cod is not really the story of a fish at all. It is the story of what we do with abundance, and whether we can learn, before it is too late, to leave a little behind. If this journey through history was worth your time, take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button, because it genuinely helps this channel keep bringing stories like this one to life. And leave a comment below telling me which forgotten piece of history you want to explore next, because I read every single one.